On May 4th, 1970, Ohio National Guardsmen were at Kent State University due to protests against the Vietnam War that had begun on May 1st. Things became wild on May 2nd, so Mayor Leroy Satcham had to call the National Guardsmen. The Guardsmen used various tactics such as tear gas and sometimes bayonets on May 2nd and 3rd to break up large crowds of student protesters. But on May 4th, something went terribly wrong. The Guardsmen, perhaps believing there was no other option, fired their weapons on the crowd of protesters, killing 4 and wounding 9. This tragedy shook the nation and sparked a fire in people's minds to bring their troops home. The Vietnam War started on November 1st, 1955, when the Communist North tried to take over the Democratic South. That started a war that would last 20 years before it would end. North Vietnam was supported by the Soviet Union and China, while the U.S. and a number of other non-communist countries supported South Vietnam. The U.S. began to send troops into Vietnam and neighboring Cambodia on March 8, 1965. This started protests throughout the nation. In 2 years, more than 500,000 were fighting, and the numbers kept on rising. On October 21, 1967, 100,000 people gathered around the Lincoln Memorial and 30,000 marched to the Pentagon, all while shouting anti-war chants. When Richard Nixon was running for president, he promised to take a majority of the troops out of Vietnam. This was a relief to everyone, but after his election on November 1968, he did not keep his promise. In fact, he announced on April 30th, 1970, that he would be sending troops into Cambodia.
This started more of an uproar. Many Americans began to protest, especially at colleges. 2,500 colleges all across the nation protested against the Vietnam War in one way or another. Most of the student strikes were started by Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS. The first protests were called teach-ins, where students would not go to class and would talk about the Vietnam War. They sometimes would do this for sessions at a time, and maybe for the whole day. That was only the first rebellious action. Some men went to college to get a deferment and get out of fighting. When first arriving at campus, they would burn their draft cards. SDS was also violent sometimes. One college that experienced growing student protests was Kent State University in Kent, Ohio. On that campus, a series of protests would escalate, resulting in a tragedy that no one had anticipated coming. On May 1st, 1970, it was peaceful on the Kent campus in the end of a Friday. Earlier that day, a teach-in had happened and a fake constitution was buried because Nixon killed it. Some students stayed behind for the weekend and went to the town of Kent. They drank at a bar and then things turned upside down. They stayed until 11 o'clock when things got violent. They blocked streets and traffic, causing the Kent mayor, Leroy Satcham, to set a curfew for Kent State students. The damage they caused that night cost $5,000 and 14 students were arrested. On May 2nd, the protests escalated when protesters burned the ROTC building on campus. At 8:45 p.m., the Ohio National Guardsmen arrived. 9 o'clock was the curfew for the students, but the students stayed out on campus. At 10 o'clock p.m., they went into the town of Kent and stopped traffic again. Soon, the action was stopped with tear gas and the students went back to campus.
On May 3rd, the students protested on campus, but were careful because of the National Guardsmen staying on campus. The students first saw a small number of guardsmen, but the number increased to more than 100. On May 4th, the protest took a tragic turn. It started at 5 a.m., and after half an hour, tear gas was being used by the National Guardsmen. Not only did they have tear gas, but they also had rifles and bayonets. The students had enough of this, and threw the tear gas canisters back at the guardsmen. Also being thrown at the guardsmen were rocks and even whole bricks. This continued for hours until General Canterbury ordered his men to load their rifles. They crouched into a kneeling position, but then they all turned around and headed up Blanket Hill. The students took this as a sign of retreat until Company G turned in sync and started firing their M1 rifles. In 13 seconds, 67 bullets were fired, hitting 13 and killing 4. Students ducked into the parking lot while others hid behind the trees. Allison Krause, Sandra Schuer, William Schroeder, and Jeffrey Miller died, and the wounded ones were Alan Canfora, John Cleary, who was trying to take a photo, Dean Kyler, who was paralyzed for life, Joseph Lewis, Thomas Grace, Donald Scott McKenzie, who was the furthest away, James Russell, Robert Stamps, and Douglas Rentmore. The Kent State shootings sparked protests across the nation. Neil Young even wrote a song named Ohio, based on the Kent State shootings. This tragedy, along with other events, finally forced the U.S. government to agree to a ceasefire, and on February 12, 1973, the majority of troops were sent home from Vietnam. The last were pulled out on March 29, 1973, and the war ended on April 30, 1975. But by then, the Americans were gone. It took a tragedy on the home front for the anti-war voices to finally triumph in their quest to bring American troops home. Were any of the people who got injured or died your friends?
I knew Allison's house. I knew her boyfriend at the time better. He was a very good friend of mine. But I did know her. Yeah.
I didn't know any of the people that were shot at the time, although I got to know them in later years. Some of them.
Did you guys see any triumph in this big tragedy? Like any good coming out of this?
No, not I. People have done their best to make the most of it and tried to learn lessons from it and so on.
No.
But there's not much good that came of it. An awful lot of harm, a lot of broken hearts.
Yes. I can tell you that every year that has gone by, it is for me, when I think about it, it's even sadder than it was when it happened. The enormity of what had happened. I don't think at the time, as I said before, I don't think it really resonated with me, just how horrendous it was. And I think a lot of it was just shock and being young. But we were all sent home after that. The campus was closed down.
Yes.
And we were all sent home.
Yes.
And I know that there several of my friends, I had 5 or 6 friends of mine that I went back to Kent the next year, but I had several friends that never came back. They went to other universities. I had a friend that was at the demonstration at the time that saw this happen and saw the student shot, that had a mental breakdown, and he recovered from it and went on to become a lawyer. But it was devastating. It's devastating to a lot of people, lots and lots of people.
Thank you.